Welcome to the Ridgemont podcast. I'm John Wallace, Managing Director of Ridgemont, a specialist construction and real estate law firm. And I'm sitting here with Victoria Lewis, a former employment solicitor and expert on workplace culture. Victoria, welcome to the Ridgemont podcast.
Hello, John. Thank you for having me.
We're going to start by talking about your career, if you don't mind. So let's go back in time. To when you were at university, you were at Southampton?
I was, many moons ago.
So did you study workplace culture?
I don't think it existed then. So I studied English. I didn't know what I wanted to do. Studied English. Didn't know what I wanted to do when I left with my degree and became a TEFL teacher, teaching English as a foreign language. And that was probably the first time that I really discovered actually the kind of the learning and the development and the training and the light bulb moments and all of those kinds of things was something that would interest me. But I still didn't know workplace culture was what I was going to do.
And did you take to teaching as a natural?
Did. I think my family would always say I was a bit of a jazz hands kind of person. But yeah, I think I did. I love, for me, it's more the facilitation rather than the kind of teaching, learning thing. I like the conversation and the ideas generation.
And then you end up coming back to the UK. Oh, so were you in the UK at that point?
I was in the UK, but I did a lot of travelling. But if I'm honest, the teaching was a vehicle to travel and have some time off. But I like to say now that that's what gave me the taste for different cultures, different perspectives. And I think it's true. I taught in Zimbabwe for a while. I did a lot of traveling in Southeast Asia, but I can't, that was backpacking. But yeah, I did it for a couple of years whilst I worked out what I wanted to do.
And then you came back and you were paralegaling at Simmons & Simmons.
I was. So, look, this was a long time ago. So this was 1991. Paralegals didn't really exist then. And I went in thinking, well, look, I'll go and do it for a month and then I'll decide if I want to study law. And I was lucky. Simmons & Simmons at the time had just landed this huge case, this BCCI case. Those the listeners who are old enough to know that was a massive bank, and it was one of those first early collapses. And I went off. The majority shareholder of BCCI was the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi. And so very soon I was sort of jetted off in a very glamorous way to Abu Dhabi, and I lived there for a year and was a paralegal, but had just the most extraordinary experience. Abu Dhabi is not the Abu Dhabi it is today.
Yeah.
And so, being in a Middle Eastern country as a woman, a young woman, it had an influence.
So what did Abu Dhabi look like at that time?
There's a lot of sand, except for some little bits of very green grass where they had all the world's water sprinklers just outside the Hilton Hotel.
Yeah.
But apart from that, one main road, and that was about it.
But not the skyline that they have today.
Not at all.
So you ended up doing your training contract at Simmons & Simmons, and then you qualified into employment.
Yes, and at the time, she says with some pride, it was the market-leading, practice for employment law. And I knew very early on, I had a trainee seat in it, and it was just like, yup, this is it. This is what is interesting to me. Finally, it's not trust. I'm sorry to say it wasn't property law. That was my first seat. And I just kind of felt like I found my home. So yes, I qualified into there and stayed there for another sort of 10 years until 2005 when I left as a managing associate.
So you'd worked your way up the tree, and having got towards the top of the tree, you decided to leave. What was it about employment law or law that made you want to leave?
That made me want to leave? I mean, the rigidity of it. And the thing about employment law was by the time I got involved, the bomb had already gone off. And everybody was scrabbling around going, "Oh, who started the bomb?" And my job was obviously who started it, because then they'll be liable.
Yeah.
And I became more interested in the complexity beneath that. In order for a bomb to go off, some stuff must have happened beforehand. And I became fascinated in what I call the messiness beneath all of that. How and why did the problems develop in the first place? why wasn't anyone looking? When someone started to see the ripples of the bomb, if you like, what did they do at that point? Or why didn't they do?
Which is not really a lawyer's job, is it? That's going deeper into commercial practices within their business.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the time, there weren't, nowadays we see in big corporates, we'll see a head of culture, a head of employee experience. Of course, there was always HR, typically a one-person band, maybe with a couple of business partners, if they were in a big bank or something. But, it was small, it was process-driven, it was transactional by nature. And yeah, there might be an ER, an employee relations team, but there wasn't a person or a body looking behind the issues and the people, and that is what interests me the most, and I think that's what my flair was in. So I was generally a litigator, but I became known as the person that could settle anything, because I think I spent a lot of time in understanding the other side's position, and that helped me in the negotiation.
And in the 9 years that you were a solicitor, did people talk about culture?
I reckon that word was used a bit in terms of unhealthy. No one knew what a healthy culture looked like, though. And no one, and in terms of other language that we're used to today, yes, diversity would be one that's used. Inclusion, no way. No way. Psychological safety, no way. Employee experience, no way. Belonging, those kind of concepts, I mean, I'm sure that, of course, they existed.
Yeah.
Of course they did. But that language wasn't commonplace.
So having left Simmons & Simmons, you joined Bernstein, a consultancy, and you ended up becoming CEO there, being very successful. In fact, I read that in February 2023, you were one of the E2E top 100 fastest growing female-led businesses in the UK for employee growth and as a disruptive business. How did you achieve that?
A lot of graft. Yeah, I wouldn't lie. It is I am proud of that accomplishment. And I worked my way up through Bernstein. At the start, it was a small founder-led business, and I think I grew it to a smaller corporate. We were never huge. We were like 50 people, something like that. Still are, and it still exists. But built 3 core service lines around. We were always a training consultancy. I think the disruptive bit that E2E liked was around the resolution side that we did. So that was independent investigations, bringing outside resource in and saying to people, right, you can trust us. We are here to get to the bottom of what's happened.
Yeah.
That might be in an investigation phase, or it might be more of a mediation, so much more trying to resolve the issue. And again, that always fascinated me, because as an employment lawyer, as I say, you came in at the end, it was damage limitation. If you're doing early conflict resolution, you are trying to keep these 2 people or 2 teams in the business, retain that talent. And I loved all of that side of it. And then also the consultancy work. So this was probably more my baby, which was I started to discover that people would call me up and say, well, so we've got this problem. And as the company became more sophisticated, the client company became more sophisticated, they might say, oh, we've got someone in diversity and inclusion, we've got someone in compliance, we've got someone in audit. And they're all saying it's a different driver. And they're all therefore saying, this is the answer.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to do, says the CEO. And I found that challenge the most interesting thing. And so how do I think we grew? I think we grew because we listened to our clients. There wasn't one size fits all. There are a lot of consultancies around, like the great, McKinsey and Deloitte's, and they're brilliant. But they're quite formulaic. And that's how they've been able to make their money at scale, right? We weren't like that. It was much more, and frankly, what interests me was trying to help that organization with that issue rather than the kind of cookie cutter approach. So I think that's how we became successful.
Not many lawyers leave the law and end up being very successful in the commercial world, and you grew a business to eventually to a fairly large consultancy. That I understand that would take a lot of work, hard work, graft as you call it, over a long period of time. Why? What motivated you?
Our purpose. So our purpose was around trying to create fairer, kinder workplaces. And that sounds so simple, but what I know from a 30-year professional career in unhealthy workplaces is that it isn't that simple. Why did I do it? Because I believe genuinely, and still do, that most people intend to create healthy workplaces, productive teams where everybody enjoys the work, they get up the next day and they come to work and all is good. I've met very few people who didn't intend that, even the ones that, when I did litigate or were on the stand and they were there for discrimination or harassment or something.
Yeah.
Their intention was pretty good, if not good. The impact of the things they said or the things they did or the decisions that they made had landed badly with someone or some people. And it's that disconnect that interests me. I have a belief that genuinely most people have positive intent. It's just not always translated into positive impact. And I guess, that's that purpose has what's kept me working 7 days a week.
There's obviously some crossover between employment law, HR, culture, all these things. But how did you become an expert in culture?
From listening, I think. The great thing about being a consultant, I think, is that you work with just such a range of different industries. So we work with a lot of financial institutions, the very big banks, the massive global banks, as well as the smaller finance houses, asset management, investment firms, full of brilliant people. Maybe sometimes the EQ didn't match the IQ, but the intent was there. So some of the more skills of producing what they wanted to produce, if you like, in terms of the commitment within the team, the productivity. So they might come up with this great innovative idea, but they couldn't land it. So financial institutions, professional firms, obviously, law firms tended to like me because they'd say, she understands our people.
She's one of that.
Yeah. I mean, beautiful affinity bias. But I made a career out of that. But I did a lot of big retail tech companies and a lot of charity work as well.
Was there any particular sector where culture was worse than in others?
I mean, it's interesting, and I guess it depending on what time. So early, in the early 200s, I would say the financial services. Now, of course, there's still a great deal of work to do there, but the FCA and the PRA, of course, are so all over them now. And in fact, they've just come out with a new consultative report, which will, the results won't be out till next year, where they've gone really far, not just in diversity, but now in inclusion. So I think the financial institutions are a lot better than what the person on the street thinks because of the reporting and the regulatory requirements. What I have found more recently, it is the organisations where one might think they're doing really well. So the startups, the tech companies, the age profile is a lot less. The formality is a lot less, and I'm a huge fan of that. There's an agile working environment, frankly, a younger workforce, and you think they've got that sewn up. But it's precisely that assumption that has sort of undermined them. And so my experience, because that kind of sector is finding it very challenging. You only need to look at, things like the kind of the BrewDog examples, and things like that, where they had this great founder-led culture, really dynamic. WeWork, and actually quite a lot of toxicity behind it.
And is it strange that we only really hear about companies when they drop the ball with workplace culture? You never hear of companies with great culture.
No, you don't. Doesn't make good news, is it? And, and I think the media scrutiny is a really important element. I mean, I know you asked me, how did I become an expert? One is my exposure to a number of different industries, but my exposure to a number of different issues. Now, they're just social issues. There's no rocket science about my job, if you like. But I think it's putting those social issues into the workplace and putting it under the lens now. So whether that is around, hybrid working, Generation Z, the polarization of the trans debate and sexual identity, or just identity at the moment. These are social issues, but you put them into a workplace, you layer on power dynamics, you layer on, and when I talk about power, that's seniority, that's tenure, that's dominant voices. You layer on the kind of high performance cultures that exist now. So, you've got to come back tomorrow. And you may have had that debate yesterday about Gaza, about trans, and you may have felt uncomfortable. But guess what? You've got to come back in tomorrow morning and you have to work with this person and you have to respect this person and you have totally different views. And that just leads to a melting pot. It leads to conflict. But what fascinates me is, because as I repeat this to you, it's so obvious, diversity of perspective is a beautiful thing, but you can't just open up your doors and go, come on in, you diverse people, off you go, because chaos and conflict will ensue. You have to anticipate, prevent, work, train, coach people to help them kind of navigate that diversity of perspective.
Well, a football team always has a manager.
Yeah.
Now, a question that we always ask on the podcast is, what's the biggest obstacle you've overcome in business?
I mean, no question. I'm sure, I bet lots of people have said this to you before, but the pandemic, no question. We sold ourselves, if you think about what I've just been talking about, I've been talking about humans and emotions in workplaces. And we sold ourselves as people who could engage and empower people in rooms, whether they were leaders, middle managers, staff, to shake the tree, to challenge the status quo. But our strapline was the sort of, we get people in rooms and we can empower them. And suddenly we were having to talk about human connection and emotions digitally and virtually. And that was really hard. That's not just changing a few PowerPoint slides. That's really thinking about what we do and how we deliver it strategically and operationally. What I would say, and of course, it'd be interesting if you had my old team here, there is no way we could have pivoted as we did. I mean, we continued with our growth strategy throughout the pandemic, even in that first year. Although in that first week of lockdown, primarily at that point, we were a training company. Everything went out of the diary, everything. And I thought I had just hired a ton of people and I thought I'm about to make a load of people redundant because there is no work. We were able to move that round in a 3-month period and make a difference within a 6-month period. The only way I believe I was able to do that was with a really engaged team who totally believed in the purpose of what we were doing and were empowered. They were agile and innovative, and they came up with some amazing stuff. I just had to put it together and sell it.
Another question that listeners will be familiar with is, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self?
God, so much, but probably for the purposes of this podcast. Good things come to those who wait. I did not know what I wanted to do at university. When I went to law school, I don't think I still even knew what I wanted to do. I was a managing associate at Simmons. I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I found my purpose in my early 40s, and it's okay. all of those things formed what I do now. My job doesn't exist. If you went to a careers advisor, they wouldn't say, oh yeah, be a workplace behavioral cultural expert. It just doesn't, it's not there. But all the things I've done have impacted that. So my advice would be slow down.
Sounds like good advice. Now, we've spoken about culture. Let's dig down a little bit. What do you think we should mean by using the word culture?
I mean, there's 1,000 and different definitions out there, John. But, for me, it is the glue. It is the norms. It is the behaviours. To a degree, it's some of the policies and processes, but really to a degree, it is the hearts and minds of the organisation. Some people say it's the business's DNA. Some will say, it's how you define how your team, interacts and behaves. It is performance. So for me, culture is not soft. It is the thing that gets you to high performance, or will totally undermine you. I read something, actually, I saw a post on LinkedIn yesterday, and someone was saying culture is the feeling that you have on a Sunday night before the Monday morning. I mean, there's obviously a good culture, is that, but, you can see what it is. It's a feeling. It is an emotion, which makes it very intangible. And a lot of people struggle with it, I think, as a concept.
And can business leaders set the culture, or is that something that has to be from the bottom up?
Business leaders must set the culture, I believe, totally in tone from the top. The FSA that I referenced earlier, they have moved from tone from the top to tone from within. They talk about a lot. For me, it is still tone from the top. They set the tone, but they're not around enough. They require managers to then set the tone on the day-to-day basis, I think. So yes, I think they need to set the tone. The bottom-up approach, I think, what is important is in the vocabulary, the articulation of the culture. So I believe for there to be a successful, a healthy culture, you've got to start with a mission or purpose. Some people call it mission, some people call it purpose, and a set of values. That mission and purpose, I think, has got to be why we exist, what we're doing, what this means to us. And the values is more about the ethics and the behaviours, how we're going to do this. And I do a lot of values and behaviours work with organisations. And my advice is always go a bottom-up approach on the values, because it's got to mean something to people. I just worked with a charity recently who had they were an environmental charity, and they had a set of values which had an acronym of green. I mean, it's gorgeous, and it's the stuff of magic, isn't it? G means this, R means this. Ask anyone in the charity, they could say it's green. They had no idea what G and R and E and E stood for, because it didn't mean anything. It didn't resonate. So it's not just a strapline. It's got to be something that everyone in that organisation can articulate and then translate into day-to-day behaviours, but also processes, pay, talent.
It touches on everything within the business. Okay, right. I'm going to read through now some statistics which I got from the internet, so caution there. I'd like to know what you think about these things. So there's an OC Tanner Institute report. That was a poll of 4,000 UK employees. 27% of those polled felt like an outsider at work. 34% of respondents did not consider their workplace a community. And then in a WorkBuzz report, which was a poll of 300 people, found that 45% of UK employees and business leaders rank great culture as the most important factor when looking for a new job. How do those two sit together?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that. And when you shared, and you're right to say a bit of caution off the internet, there are so many reports out there, and for everyone, you'll find something with a contrary percentage. But I'm not surprised at what you've said there. And there's no question that since the pandemic, and especially 2021, workplaces have really struggled with engagement and culture. But I have seen a huge decline in the last couple of years. And I wanted to share some of my own stats with you. And I would, encourage anyone who's listening this to Google Gallup. They have some great stuff.
Yeah.
And they were looking what they are highlighting at the moment, and certainly from my own anecdotal experience, the decline is really seen in managers, what I would call middle managers. And Gallup's recent survey showed that there'd been a drop from 36% to 31% in the last 2 years in terms of engagement levels for managers. That there was an increase in managers feeling burnt out, that there was a rise in managers looking for new jobs, up from 48 to 55% this year. And again, a real striking one, they were asked, managers were asked whether they thought their organisation cared about them, about their well-being. And this had gone down, only 22% thought their organisation cared about them. Now, these are managers, so this is just huge. And I think the problem that we're facing at the moment is, one, yes, you've got the scrutiny that we talked about. You've got Generation Z, who are, rightly so in my view, demanding more from their workplaces. But you have got an exhausted middle management. One, they were the ones that were pivoting their own companies during the pandemic. They had their foot on the gas, and nothing has let up in that. And again, what Gallup went on to look at, they asked these middle managers, what was the organizational change? 64% said employees were given additional job responsibilities, 51% cited restructuring of teams, and 42% reported budget cuts. So what you've got is managers having more work to do on a tighter budget with either reduced teams or new teams. Now, the new teams thing is always interesting for me because I think, wow, what's the culture like in a new team? Or where you've got restructuring happening, two cultures coming together. It could be between a big merger, two totally different cultures coming together. But cultures exist within the same organization between different teams, And so for me, that's like, wow, that's no wonder managers are feeling different.
The stat that jumped out then was that 55%, so a majority of managers, were looking for a new job.
Yeah.
So for the employers and senior management listening to this podcast, that's a startling figure.
It really is. It really is. And I used to see things around looking for another job and what that meant. This particular survey, this is actively looking. This is, the push and pull. I'm not sitting here wondering whether to take the headhunter's call or not. I'm actively seeking and putting myself out there. Now, what change in your mindset exists at that point? When you know you're leaving, that you're ready to leave. Let's put it this way. Difficult to imagine you can be working at optimum performance at that time.
Yeah, for sure. And so what can organizations do to address these types of problems and develop their culture?
So as I said, definitely you need to get some of your statements right. And I do believe they're not posters on the walls. So a good mission statement, which says why you exist, a set of values that the workforce are behind. And they're the barometers, if you like, for all decision-making, all behaviours, something that people can cling on to, that marker in the sand. And of course, you need more guardrails in place. So you need policies, you need guidance, you need all of that. That's all the easy stuff. The difficult stuff then is thinking about, right, how does this show up? On a Wednesday morning, what would it look like? So you really then need to think about how do we engage people in the hearts and minds? So it's about the emotions and the mindsets. Obviously, I'm going to say this, but I believe in the power of training. I really do. I don't believe in the power of lecturing. I believe in the power of people sitting in a room and unlocking their own thought processes. So I am a huge advocate of coaching, targeted coaching, whether that's for managers, leadership, or whatever. You've got to have a strong feedback culture, definitely. What makes a strong feedback culture is not just the giving of feedback, it's how people respond to it. So I used to do a lot of work with people and how they receive feedback, because if there's a threat response and defensiveness in the room, you've got polarization rather than two people coming together and working towards something. So I do think all of that helps. But undoubtedly for me, if someone said, what's the key thing for a healthy culture and how do you get it? And that is seeking out psychological safety. Now, psych safety is, again, a hard concept to get our heads around. I think we all believe we've got it in our organizations. The question is, have we? And are we asking the right people? Leaders will say, oh, yeah. And what does it mean? It means that everybody here can speak up about anything they want to say without fear of embarrassment, humiliation, ridicule, blame, failure. So on one level, we're talking about disclosures. We're talking about Lucy Letby, if you like, and a lot of the research on psychological safety has happened in hospitals where there is often a strong hierarchy and a fear of speaking up over mistakes.
Yeah.
But it is also, around contrary views. The whole point about saying, come on in, you diverse perspective you, is to say, let's have a different perspective. Well, then that means that in a room on a Wednesday morning, someone's going to be sitting at that table going, hold on a sec, I've got a slightly different view. And the question is, what happens next? Does someone feel that they can speak up? And remember, let's just think about, why is it so difficult in a workplace? Because of the power dynamic.
Yeah.
So is that a senior person in the room? Or how else can power show up? Power can show up, as I said, from tenure. Someone who's been here who feels like they've got the bigger voice. The funny guy or gal, okay, or the insider group. Or let's think about hybrid working. Let's think about someone who's not in the room. And the people who are in the room, of course, have all just walked down from the coffee machine. They're chatting, and they've probably done some of the meeting's business on the way to the meeting room.
Yeah.
I dial in because it's my day when I dial in, and I'm slightly out of it already, as well as all the kind of Zoom links. And, there are other providers, but you know what I mean? And so power is showing up in a very different way, I think. So for me, what do you need to focus on? You really need to focus on how psychologically safe people feel there.
That's interesting. What we're going to talk about now is essentially some of the practicalities of workplace culture. So how workplace culture can be seen in the workplace. And I think the listeners will be surprised by some of the things that you're going to talk about now. So let's take a typical day in the office. And it starts as a chat around the coffee machine.
Yeah, chat around the coffee machine. No risk there, is there? Because we're just going to talk about what happened at the weekend, or we're going to talk about what we watched on telly, or I'm going to talk about what I've just seen on my social media feed. And of course, discomfort can result. So, on one level, it could be the B word, banter. It could be just a conversation that I'm interested in, I'm passionate about, whatever. Something happens whereby I have a conversation with you, let's say, as we're pouring our coffee, and I start talking about something I watched last night. And I forget that we're not in a private conversation, that we are in a workplace full of very different people. And I forget that actually, even though I know you really well, and we've had this conversation before, and we may have had it outside the workplace, and I'm just continuing a conversation, but I forget that, Barry's over there making his cup of tea, who's never been party to our conversation. I forget that actually Barry doesn't know us very well. I forget that Barry doesn't actually work with us, but we share a coffee machine. And I forget that actually what might be okay for you and I might be Barry's extreme, or vice versa. There's no one position in this. And I think that is this level of self-awareness that I see all the time, that we forget where we are, who we're with, who could hear it. And then I forget that actually the person that may not feel okay might be inhibited from saying to me, actually, Victoria, what you've just said bothers me a bit. I often liken it to, if I'm on the tube, although you'll probably have seen there's a ton of posters now about active bystanders on the tube or on the buses, the things that you could say in the moment to intervene if there's some inappropriate behaviour. Ultimately, probably most of us on this podcast will have stepped off a tube, will have stepped off a bus to leave that situation. We've done a risk assessment, or we're tired, or it's not our business, or we've decided it's too risky for us, and we leave. And many of us may have had sleepless nights about it, but most of us will have been able to place it somewhere. What we won't have done is seen that person the next morning. And there's something about workplaces. Not only have I got to see you when you bothered me yesterday, when you crossed my line, but I've got to come back in tomorrow, see you again, and place this discomfort somewhere. And what I've seen happening over the years is that discomfort doesn't go, it just gets logged in your memory at some point. You will say something else. You will talk about this topic again that you were passionate about, or crack another joke or something. And all that happens is that file goes to the front of your filing cabinet in your brain. And of course, there is a cumulative effect. So I remember a case so long ago.